The next step of the process is to adhere the frame to the vinyl panels. These are the fiberglass components of the main frame. These will all be put into a single clear vinyl tube, which will then be adhered to the main vinyl sheet. This is 17.5 inches long, this is 14.5 inches long, this is 11.5 inches long, this is 26.5 inches long, then it's symmetrical on the other side. So these are the fiberglass cross braces. These are 25 inches long. These will be thermoformed into pockets of vinyl, which will then be glued to the main panel. The fiberglass rods for the cross braces and for the main frame are all 1/4 inch in diameter. I have here a piece of clear vinyl tube. This is 5/16 inch inner diameter and 7/16 inch outer diameter. I'm now going to slide these main components into the tube in order. So I'll start with the longest piece here. So here we have all the component tube rods slid into the clear vinyl tube. You can see that the joints actually have a 1/2 inch gap, and these are centered on the crease lines in the main panel. You can see that the vinyl tube is actually 1 inch longer than the main panel, so the tube is actually 74 inches in length. I'm now going to snip the tube 3/4 of an inch from the end of the fiberglass rod. I will now use a heat gun set to 640 degrees Fahrenheit, and then I'm going to heat the end of the tube until I see it warp. And then I'm going to use these pair of pliers to clamp down on the edge and seal it. So I'm going to push the rod until it meets the end here. So you want to do this before doing the other end to make sure that the tube matches with the end of the panel. The rods inside the tube actually have to be readjusted again, so make sure you put them back in their original location before heat welding the other end. You can see that the tube now juts out of the main panel by like 1/2 inch. You want to cut the tube right at the edge of the panel so that the heat weld actually butts up against the rod. Now we're going to heat weld this end just like we did the other end.
Okay, so for the cross braces, we aren't going to put these in vinyl tubes. We could, that is an alternative way to make this. However, we have been thermoforming vinyl pockets. This is a little bit stronger because you have a larger surface area to bond as opposed to just the bottom edge of a tube. But this is a little bit more time consuming to do it this way. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our fiberglass cross braces. These are 25.5 inches long. And we're going to use some double-sided tape to stick them down. So we're going to roll the fiberglass onto the double-sided tape. And now we're going to stick this down onto the vinyl, making sure that we have a margin around the edges. Just about like that. So it should stick really, really well and be nice and firm on there. Now when I'm making these, I usually do all 3 of these at once. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to just do one. But ordinarily I would stick all 3 of these down, adhere them, and then we're going to thermoform them, which I'll show you next. And like I said, this time I'm just going to do this first one for the sake of brevity. Okay, so the way this works is we're going to flip this upside down, we're going to heat this vinyl, and then we're going to use these aluminum extrusions on the edge to stretch the vinyl around the shape of the tube. Now, this is kind of a time-consuming process. It's not very quick, but it produces pretty nice results that are very easy to adhere to the final product. So once again, we're going to use our heat gun. This is actually a plastic welding gun from McMaster-Carr. and it is set to 640 degrees Fahrenheit. Now the temperature is important, and it may vary a little bit between different stocks of vinyl, but it's important to be able to melt the vinyl or get close to melting the vinyl without burning it. So usually the way I start this is on one end, and I'll start slowly heating the vinyl, and I'll press down on these aluminum extrusions, and eventually I have some weights over to the side here that I'll place on here to kind of help stretch it. So now I'm going to place this right up to the edges, kind of stretch that vinyl, let it set for a second. So we're letting it cool to kind of hold in place that shape we just gave it. Now if we take a look, we'll see that we already have a pretty good pocket right here on our vinyl. And so this is kind of a permanent shape now in the face of the vinyl. And we'll just keep doing that, moving down the length of the rod. Okay, so now that we've gone along the whole length and the vinyl is nice and soft along the whole length of the tube, we can start to really stick these together. And we can also put a weight on either end so that we can hold this in place while we do our kind of final pass at forming this vinyl. So now the aluminum has gotten a little bit warm, so I'm going to let it set for just a few seconds to hopefully let that vinyl cool so that that form that we've just pressed into it will set a little bit. Okay, so you can see we actually have a really nice pocket formed into that vinyl. So you see the edges lay flat, and the fiberglass rod is inside of this little tunnel that we've formed into the vinyl. Now the only thing we need to do is flatten these edges, and then we can trim the piece out and glue it onto our main panel. Okay, so I'm going to flatten out these ends. So I'm just going to heat them until they start to flow a little bit, and then I'm going to use this aluminum extrusion to flatten them out. Okay, so we have a very nice thermoformed piece of vinyl. All the ends are mostly flat. There's a little bit of bend in them, but that'll be fine. That'll glue right down when we glue this to the final vinyl. Now I'm going to trim a little bit off. I don't need this much margin around here to glue down, so we're going to leave maybe about 3/4 of an inch or maybe as little as 1/2 an inch on the edge here. And that's it. We have a beautifully thermoformed piece of vinyl. Here you can see I've laid out the fiberglass cross braces in their thermoformed pockets on the vinyl where I will glue them later. Here you can see a close-up view of the way I'm laying out these fiberglass rods on the vinyl. Notice that there's a slight gap between this dashed line right here, which is the crease line, and the end of the fiberglass rod. So remember, the width between these crease lines is 26 inches. However, the length of the fiberglass rod is 25 inches. So there should be a 1/4 of an inch gap between the end of this and the dashed crease line. The fiberglass rod should align exactly over the crease line that corresponds with the rod. So next we're actually going to glue the pocket to the main panel of vinyl. So the glue that we use is this HH66 vinyl cement. We've been purchasing this from Amazon. I haven't found any local hardware stores that carry this, but it's fairly available on Amazon. Now, the can does have an integrated brush. However, I've found that it's very difficult to precisely and quickly apply the cement using the brush. So I prefer to use a syringe. So this is just a standard 5 milliliter syringe with a luer lock fitting, and we have a dispensing needle here. So this dispensing needle is not sharp, but it's just a somewhat large diameter needle that we can use to dispense the glue. So if I load my syringe up, and we're ready to go. And it's actually quite nice. You can store the glue for several days like this. The tip of the needle will clog a little bit, but generally you can pull that glue right out. Now we're going to glue the vinyl pocket onto the main vinyl panel. So we're probably going to use basically this entire syringe between the two sides of this pocket, which is, again, a 5 milliliter syringe. We're going to run a nice thick bead of glue kind of all the way down this edge. Make sure it's positioned right where we want it. And then we're going to clamp down with this aluminum extrusion to make sure that it's all pressed nice and firmly into the vinyl. We want to make sure those vinyl surfaces are in contact, good contact for several minutes so that they bond nice and strongly. Okay, now I've pulled off the clamp holding down this side of the extrusion, or this side of the vinyl pocket. Ordinarily, I would leave this clamped while I glue the next side, but I want you guys to be able to see what's happening a little bit better. So once again, we're going to lay a nice thick bead of glue all the way down the edge. You can see we have just a little bit of glue left. And now once again, we're going to clamp this down with our aluminum extrusion. We'll do both sides this time. Put some weights on the ends. Make sure that we're right up against those edges. And then let this set for 10 or 15 minutes is usually enough to make sure that it's bonded enough to handle. Okay, so the last thing I need to do to finish this process here is add just a little bit of extra glue to the end. Typically when you're gluing along the edges, it's very easy to not get the glue to go to the very edge. So I'm just going to add a little bit of glue to the end here. Make sure these little end flaps are thoroughly adhered. And then while that starts to set, I'm also going to snip out this corner so that we can get our notch in the vinyl. Okay, the next step is to glue the main frame elements down onto the main panel of vinyl. You can see that I've lined them roughly up where they'll go. So here you can see a close-up view of one of these joints. So remember that each of these rods is ½ inch shorter than the length. So in between any two of these, there should be approximately a ½ inch gap. So you can see here that I have this lined up so that that gap occurs right where the cross brace intersects. Additionally, remember that the cross brace should have a ½ inch gap here. So it should be just enough that the tubing should rest on the thermoformed pocket. It shouldn't rest on the actual pouch with the fiberglass rod inside of it. So underneath here you can see our line that we've drawn to illustrate where this should go, and you can see that we're placing that exactly on top. Now once we have it in position, I'll put a weight on this side. That way I can keep that in place while I glue the other side. Okay, so now we're ready to glue. We're going to make sure again that our rod is lined up just right on the vinyl and that we are maintaining the correct gap. And then this will be really simple. We're just going to place a nice bead of glue along our dashed line. And then we're going to stick it down. And then we're going to place some weights on top of this to make sure that the vinyl bonds really well. Now we're ready to join the second rod on here. Again, check the gap before you glue and just place a nice bead of glue along the dashed line. And then press it down, place a weight to get it to bond. Two. We're going to do the third now. Now this one's shifted a little bit, so I'm going to reorient the rod just to where it needs to be. And then again, a nice bead of glue right down our line. Press it into place and place the weight. Now we're ready for the last section of the main frame. Sometimes we may have gotten our tubing a little bit too short and you may have to stretch it just a little bit. In this case, our lengths are just right. But remember, in the end, you want to maintain this gap here and you want to make sure that the tubing comes right to the end of the vinyl here. So again, we're going to put down our bead of glue. And we're going to press this into place and clamp it down with a weight. You can see that I've used 3 milliliters of glue for this. So in total, we're at about 18 milliliters between the 3 cross braces and the main frame. And then once we do the other side of the main frame, we'll be a little bit over 20 milliliters of glue. Now we have the last 2 pieces that we need to glue to the main panel for it to be completed. So the first of those is the rear arch. So we have a 60-inch length of this encapsulated rod, but this is not 1/4 inch diameter. This is 3/16, so it's slightly smaller diameter, so that we can bend it to this shape. To get this to fit properly, we actually leave 4 inches between the bottom of the fiberglass and the bottom of the device. And you'll see when you set it in this way that the end of the arch sticks up just a little bit beyond the fiberglass cross beam. So when we glue it, we're going to push it down just like this and hold it in place. So this ensures that there's always a little bit of compression pushing up on the back of the device. Just like, because of the arch shape, we're going to have some spring force straightening out and keeping this face nice and flat. Now, gluing this is a very simple exercise. We just take our syringe of glue. I like to just place a little bit under this edge. So, like I said, this arch is compressed right now, and it's only being held in place because the vinyl sticks to itself just a little bit. But we're going to glue it on both edges like this, which will give us a really strong bond so that it will last under that tension for a long time. And then, of course, we're going to put a weight on there and let that sit for 10 minutes or so before we try to handle it. And now we'll do the other edge. Exact same process. And then we'll place a weight on there. Once you've let the ends dry for just a minute or so, leave the weights in place, but now you can prepare to glue the top of the arch. So if you press it down, it should hold itself in place just from the stickiness of the vinyl. If it doesn't, just a finger to hold it in place will be fine. And once again, just place a nice amount of glue on the surfaces where the vinyl is in contact. I like to do both sides. This part here is going to be another high tension joint, so we want to make sure that that we have plenty of glue and that it's well bonded. So we'll put another weight on there and let that dry for 10 minutes or so. Now, after we've done that, we're going to go along the edges of the arch and just put a nice thin bead of glue just to make sure this tube gets bonded with there. This is not critical. This is just to keep the tube from flopping around a little bit. And we'll just put a weight on there to hold it in place so that it doesn't slide at all, and then do the same thing to the other side. Now the last piece of framing that we have to put on the main panel is the arch that goes around the oval glove ports on the front of the device. Inside of our vinyl tubing, we have two 1/8 inch fiberglass rods. This enables us to get a tighter bend radius on the corners so that we can avoid those oval hand ports. Unlike the arch on the back, this does go all the way down to the bottom, so you don't have to worry about measuring exactly from the bottom. Now, it's not going to be possible to hold that in place while we're gluing, so what we're going to do is just glue one side at a time, and we'll glue it from the bottom up to about maybe the second hole on these hand ports. Kind of glue that straight and let that cure, and then bend it and glue to the same way on the other side. So for the first one here, again, very simple. Just going to lay down a bead of glue in between these. Kind of roll them into place. And then I like to put a bead of glue on the top as well. And then a weight to let it hold in place. Now we're going to bend it for the other side. And again, we're going to glue it to about here or so. And if it starts to peel up a little bit, adding additional weights to the corners to keep that bend radius tight can be helpful. So now we're going to need to let this dry for 10 minutes before we attempt to glue the top of the arch. Because in doing that, we're going to get a pretty tight bend radius, and consequentially, we're going to have quite a lot of tension on the glue bonds here. We've let the sides sit for about 10 minutes so that they should be pretty well adhered at this point. And now we're just going to bend this middle arch down so that it kind of sits along this. Now, this is not going to want to stay in place on its own, so we're definitely going to need to use a weight here. And then we're going to kind of glue all along the edges of this to hold it in place. So I'm going to let the rest of this dry for another 10 minutes or so. And then I'll take the weight off and I'll just re-glue in the middle section and put the weight back on. Now that we've let it dry for a few minutes, we're going to finish gluing the top just to make sure that it's extra strong. Put a bead of glue along the section that was covered by the weight on both the side there as well as underneath. We're going to put that weight back on, let it set for a little bit longer, and then it should be completely finished. All that we have left to do is to attach our glove ports. So we have two sets of flanges, one that goes on the outside, one that goes on the inside. The outside should have through holes for these 1/4-20 screws. The inside is tapped. So if we grab two threaded pieces, so now one of the key ideas here is that these ring shapes overlap so that we have the bigger piece overlapping with the smaller piece so that we don't have a joint that goes all the way through the edges. It keeps it a little bit more rigid. Here you can see the completed main panel. It has 3 cross braces, 2 tubes of main framing, an arch on the front, an arch on the back, and 2 oval hand ports on the front.